Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar here at the National Library of Scotland. Of course, I say here, welcome to my flat here in East Lothian. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the library. All 200 of you that have signed up to view tonight's event are more than welcome. It's just a little bit small in here to fit you all in, so we're doing it via Zoom as always. Tonight, I'm delighted to be introducing Patrick Lawrie, who is here to talk about his new book, Native: Life in a Vanishing Landscape. Patrick is a freelance journalist. His blog, Working for Grouse, is visited by over 30,000 visitors each year. As well as writing and farming, he works for Soil Association Scotland on a programme which supports conservation projects on farmland. His first book, The Black Grouse, was the first natural history book on this rare and declining species. This new book was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize for UK Nature Writing 2020, and The Times, who named it one of their nature books of the year, said, and I quote, "This is a memoir born out of moments of wonder and pain. It is not so much a lament for a lost way of being, but the loving story of trying to find it again." I'm so looking forward to hearing more later. But before I hand over to Patrick, can I just say that there'll be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So get thinking and type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Patrick.
Go ahead,
Patrick, you're live.
Thank you, Kenny. I've always felt a strong need to belong in a place, to be surrounded by a blend of community and landscape that was distinctly my own. Having been born and brought up in Galloway, I immediately cleaved to the idea of hereditary places and the feeling of natural continuity between the generations. My family has moved around a great deal over the last 200 years, but we've mainly managed to stay within the confines of 3 or 4 parishes around the town of Dalbeattie. Even as a small child, I framed that powerful sense of belonging as the acute awareness of being Scottish. I went to see the rugby at Murrayfield and was thrilled to feel like I was part of something all connected. As a small boy walking up from Haymarket with my father, I could imagine myself playing a tiny role in representing something very special. And I marvelled at strange northern accents from Fort William and Aviemore, larger than life Aberdonians, and all manner of unexpected folk from Angus and Fife. In the morning before a match, I'd lie in bed and imagine Scotland quietly stirring in the distance. I could picture people running for buses in Dingwall and small boats cruising across lochs in Argyll towards beckoning railway terminals. People of all shapes and sizes converging on Edinburgh to take part in some vast shared experience. It would take 2 hours for us to get to Edinburgh, frequently in my father's car with his friends through Dumfries to Moffat and over the Beef Tub to the city. Way back in bygone days, my grandfather had a farm along that road near Drumelia, at the very top of the borders, in a landscape that was part of the continuity of the southern uplands. We'd often stop on the way to the rugby for a pint at the Crook at Tweedsmuir. Tup horns above the bar and the stink of unfiltered Capstan cigarettes, that was my vision of tough country for real men, our piece of Scotland's puzzle to place beside the Bruntsfield softies and the hairy-kneed Highlanders. Then a descent down to Edinburgh and the growing bustle of people in the streets, down between barriers and through the turnstiles, and then that amazing, breathless moment when you come out into the stand and it's dusk and there's 60,000 well-lit people waiting to get started. My first trip to Murrayfield was almost 30 years ago, and I had this very clear idea that Scotland made perfect sense. We were all just parts of the same thing, revolving around Edinburgh as a hub. And above all else, we absolutely weren't England. As if to emphasize that fact, England lay beyond the sea. From my family's farm, it's about 15 miles of salt water to Maryport. On sunny days, my school friends and I used to complain that we could see England too clearly. As part of one game we played, we used to wear blindfolds and spin ourselves round and round in circles. If, when you stopped, you were facing south towards the Lake District, you lost. I don't think there were any other rules. All we wanted to do was look north at Scotland. That lovely simplicity fell to bits as a teenager when I took holidays to Wester Ross and Sutherland. I loved those trips, but they were exotic places and it took 8 hours to get there in the car. Then I worked on fishing boats in the Outer Hebrides and realized that I was completely lost in my own home country. People wouldn't talk to me because I sounded English. 4 years at university in Glasgow gave me a different Scotland, and then work and friends on Royal Deeside showed me something entirely different again. And at the same time, I was also thrilled to realise that I had a lot in common with farmers and country folk in the Pennines and on the Isle of Man. Northern England and the Irish Sea was a far more natural fit for me than Perth or Skye. That Scottish idea felt weaker than ever, and all the while I started to home in on my real place of origin, the southwest. And that's not just Dumfries and Galloway, but specifically Galloway. I'd always been fixated on my home, but I'd been viewing it as part of a bigger nation. That was an uncomfortable fit, and it began to make a great deal more sense to look at Galloway as a place in its own right. As soon as I began to do that, the floor seemed to open up, and I was just in free fall with an obsessive, exciting, and often extremely painful relationship with place. About 5 years ago, I was involved in a project to campaign for a national park in Galloway. As part of the consultation, the campaign directors decided that they wanted to leave the borders unmarked. They said it would be a useful tool for discussion to ask people to draw where they thought Galloway was. It was interesting to see that as conversations began around establishing a boundary for Galloway, people were very undecided about where it actually was. They drew vague lines in a loop from Stranraer to Dumfries, but some of these went far up into Ayrshire, and others just skimmed a few miles inland from the Solway. There was no consensus on where the boundary should be, and that felt strange, given the fact that this place used to be an independent kingdom, with a very distinct sense of itself. The National Park campaign tapped into a powerful but strangely ambiguous sense of Galloway identity. In trying to establish consensus over ideas of national identity and self, people are sometimes asked if they feel more Scottish or British or European. I know lots of people who would refuse all options and introduce themselves as coming from Galloway, even though they know that's not the point of the question. And they probably know they'd have to explain what Galloway is, and how it's not Galway, and how it's what the G stands for in D&G. For my part, I draw a line which others might dispute around this place, with a divider between the Stewartry of Kirkcudbright and Wigtonshire. My own piece is a fine big square of countryside, with corners at Newton Stewart, Custhorne, Moneyhive and Cusfern. Still, others might argue with me on that, and my very clear idea of local identity is at odds with the fact that it's up for discussion. And while many of us are ready to fight to the death on behalf of Galloway, we're also oddly modest. During the National Park consultation, I spoke to a farmer who argued against our designation because we don't really deserve it. He said, "I love Galloway as much as anyone, but we're not exactly Loch Lomond." And in some ways that's true. We have our moments, but this is not a staggeringly beautiful place in any conventional sense. We have high hills and broad moors, neat farms and a lovely coast, but from the perspective of a passerby, none of it is breathtakingly stunning. We have no Glencombe moment to make you sit up and gasp. Some of our best landscapes are tucked miles away at the back of moorland tracks, which aren't suited to camper vans or cyclists. As an interest in tourism has developed over the last 30 years, that awkwardness has really worked against Galloway. We haven't picked up trade like they do in the Lake District, and all the while traditional industries have collapsed. Fishing has all but failed, and our quarries are defunct. Farming has been completely reinvented into commercial superproduction. We now produce about half of Scotland's milk, and multi-millionaire farmers keep their 1,000-cow dairy herds indoors all year round in pursuit of fine efficiency. And yet, as a small handful of people have made a huge amount of money from these changes, Galloway feels oddly adrift in the world. We have some of the most deprived and isolated rural communities in Scotland. There's almost no work for young people. High streets are boarded up and communities feel oddly disparate and disconnected. That's partly why the National Park campaign was started, to address that feeling that we're just being left behind. And the National Park campaign was equally worried about some of the changes which began to take place after the Second World War. My grandparents and their grandparents before them farmed in hill country across Galloway. We have a unique tradition of upland farming here, particularly based around hardy cattle. Hundreds of thousands of acres of moorland run across this place, and we worked out how to make those acres profitable with sheep and cows. but a need for timber has overhauled that old industry. Starting in the 1950s, Galloway was ploughed so that it could be converted into a forest. Vast areas of moorland were brought into state ownership and completely reimagined. The place became something new and more efficient. The early years of planting were hard on everything. Moorland birds were decimated, and the rivers ran dark with peat erosion which killed off the fish. It's very hard to overstate the epic magnitude of what happened in here in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And from an ecological perspective, it was an absolute catastrophe, which we will be paying to restore for generations to come. Curlews came to symbolize this loss. These beautiful moorland birds had stood for centuries as an icon of Galloway, but the new plantations swept them into non-existence. That came hard to me as a young boy growing up on my family's farm, where curlews felt like an important part of our lives. The curlew's call hung over everything we did, and then suddenly it was gone. Over the last 30 years, we've lost more than 3/4 of our curlews in Galloway. It's not the winds of change, but more like a hurricane. I'd been asked to include a few readings from the book alongside this talk, and it seems like an obvious moment to introduce curlews in chapter 1. Unremarkable in flight, obscure in plumage, and secretive to the point of rumour, curlews are unlikely heroes. But then they call over the shore and sing beneath the high stacked clouds, and there is nothing else of value. No other wild bird has that power to convey a sense of place through song. It's a grasping belly roll of belonging in the space between rough grass and tall skies, and you never forget it. The curlew's call became the year-long sound of my childhood. I hear that liquid, loving list, and I'm lying in the warm, sheepy grass again, a small boy in 2 big wellies, hugged by old familiar hills. So I thought that curlews were mine. The connection was a live wire, but then I found that the birds had a place in all of us. My entire family would rush out to the kitchen door at night to hear curlews passing between our chimney and the wide, dusty moon. We all loved them, so when I began to think that the birds belonged only to Galloway. In time, I'd grow up and go elsewhere, and that's when I learned that curlews are loved by anybody who'll take the time to listen to them. People are devoted to curlews in Wales and Ireland, on Shetland and Exmoor. The birds have starred in heraldry, tradition and folklore for thousands of years. Everybody's tempted to claim the curlew, and when you know them, no other bird can boast of such universal popularity. Being sensitive to change and wedded to the nature of wide open landscapes, curlews were blown away by the new forests which rose around them. They simply collapsed, and as they died, we said goodbye to something far more significant than feathers and a long curved beak. In the midst of this transition, I began to explore the possibilities of farming for myself. Galloway's famous for its cattle, and the whole world knows about Belties. Tough, low-maintenance livestock is our stock in trade, and they make a powerful statement about who we are in this part of the world. Sturdy, stubborn, and tough as old boots. By a chance conversation, I happened to hear of a local farmer who'd begun to work with Rigget Galloway cattle, and I was curious to find out more. Riggets have an extraordinary backstory, and for that it's worth going back to the book again. The ancient primordial herds of Galloway cattle probably looked like a muddle, a churning mix of black, red, brown, dun and white animals. Some were belted with a white band around their bellies, and there were all kinds of other markings and patterns which lay somewhere in between. As momentum gathered in breeding, farmers began to focus on pure black cattle, black, black and only black as the saying goes. The Galloway Cattle Society was established in 1878 and set down many of the conventions which had already become habit. They decreed that only 3 colours should be recognised as true. Red and dun were popular, but black was king. Black Galloways would go on to power the beef industry in the south of Scotland for the next century, and in time they'd cast a broad shadow across the world. The future was less promising for animals which failed to conform. Some of the oldest Galloways were black animals with a white stripe along their spines and under their bellies. These were called Rigget Galloways, pointing to the pitched white rig on their back. Irish farmers made a fetish of these same beautiful markings, and they developed the beautiful Moyle breed with the same white line. And maybe that's where our rigs came from to start with, but whatever the explanation, Rigget markings were not approved by the Galloway Cattle Society. The beasts were held to be scruffy and obscure. We wanted nothing more to do with them. The genes which govern Rigget markings are recessive, and the pattern is easily suppressed. By contrast, black Galloway genetics are absurdly dominant. Put a black Galloway with any other breed and the calf will always be black and hornless. Even a red, horny Highlander will toe the line. Nature seemed to be steering farmers towards conformity, and Rigget calves were no longer kept for breeding. The society built a structure which allowed farmers to focus and refine their efforts, but it also ironed out rich seams of variety. A fine, subtle shred of our ancient agricultural heritage was rushed out of sight in a few short years. But Riggets continued to pop up here and there over the next century in a series of bizarre genetic throwbacks. Humans soon forgot about them, and unexpected Rigget calves were seen as inexplicable freaks. My grandfather worked with Galloway cattle all his life, but he'd have been stumped by the sight of a Rigget. In contrast, his grandfather would have recognized Riggets immediately, and maybe he would have thought that judging a cow by its markings was a fairly shallow business. It happened that a beautifully marked Rigget calf was born in the 1980s near Kirkcudbright. Like many others before her, the little heifer came as a bolt from the blue. Both of her parents had been purebred pedigree Galloways, and there was nothing to suggest that a Rigget calf could even be possible from the pairing. The farmer was puzzled, but he raised the calf and set her on the road to being a fine young beast. Whatever the explanation for those bizarre markings, the heifer had no value as a breeding animal. It's no use worrying about these things, and at least she'd make a good carcass at the abattoir in Castle Douglas. The tale turns strange when you hear that another Rigget calf was born that year on a different farm a few miles away. Here was a little bull, just as unexpected. Throwbacks like these happen now and again, but two at once in the same place is something extraordinary. There was no reason for either farmer to do any more than shrug, but they were curious enough to find out more. With the backing of friends in high places, Rigget Galloways began a long climb out of obscurity. Some people actively disliked the Riggets and thought they were mongrels, which gave the Galloways a bad name. A few took active steps to stymie the Riggets' resurrection, but other farmers were persuaded to keep their own throwbacks and use them for breeding. The markings were quietly kindled back into life, but always in tiny numbers and often clustered around southern England. Now there's even a Rigget Galloway Cattle Society, which serves as a network for people who love the markings. The animals are registered as pedigree as much as that's possible. But still some people say that Rigget Galloways are worth nothing at all because you can't breed them true. That's a fair point. You put a Rigget bull with a Rigget cow and you still need to roll the dice for a Rigget calf. You might end up with something that's black, or white, or somewhere between, but that's how the old herds used to work. The important thing is that these are Galloway cattle, and they're defined by unpredictable markings. There's no such thing as the perfect Rigget, and in a world of cast iron regulations, that creates some nice space for personal preference. A handful of Riggets remain in Galloway, and I went to see my first beasts as an act of curiosity on a warm, sunlit evening in September. Restless swallows crowded along the telephone wires which connect Balmaclellan to the outside world, and the moor smelled of old bracken and dry moss. We climbed up through the light fields until the land opened up beyond us. Hills loomed over a winding loch, and the drab familiar shapes of Corserine, Kensmore, and the Garrick. The cows belong to Richard, and he's good with his animals. He's gentle and softly spoken, and he chatted to them as if they were dear old friends. He checked off their details on a folded piece of paper, and then he clasped his hands quietly behind his back. Of course I was smitten. These beasts smelled of cud and honesty, lightly shaken from the leaves of a history book. I drank them in and found that they were home incarnate, a place conjured up in curls and long soft eyelashes. I warmed to the Rigget colours in a heartbeat, blacks and whites swirling together like a freshly poured pint of stout. I'd always been dead set upon black Galloways like my grandfather, but there was no way I could ever walk away from these animals. I chose one calf for her markings, and another for her shape, a broad tubby barrel with a wrinkle of fat around her neck. Richard shook my hand and we sealed the deal, but here was a squeak of dishonesty on my part. I didn't have any money to pay for them. But I reassured myself that there were still 3 months to worry about that. The calves were young and couldn't leave their mothers until Christmas, giving me enough time to scrape some cash together. So not only was I completely sold on Riggets, but I was so impressed with the fact that these animals were absolutely ours. Something so totally based in Galloway that they almost represented a totem for us. It's ironic that most Rigget Galloways are found in other parts of the UK nowadays. But I was struck by a comment from a hill farmer from Devon when he came to look at buying some of my own livestock a few years ago. Shivering in the cold and standing up to his knees in bog myrtle and heather, he said something like, "You can take the rigget out of Galloway, but you can't take the Galloway out of the rigget." Sure enough, those animals are us, and we are them, even when they're off in other parts of the world. It's entirely fitting that they should be an obscure breed, because people in Galloway are too. If I had been dancing around the idea of getting into farming, these cows pushed me into the deep end. I remember a clear conversation I held with myself about getting cows and how farming sort of followed on afterwards. And I was also clear on what might be possible with sound, sustainable agriculture. Hill farming can be great for conservation. The reason why curlews are such a powerful and obvious symbol of Galloway is that cows have been managing our hills for centuries. What's good for cows is great for curlews, and it makes sense to think of them as two outputs from the same mechanism. But alongside the mass commercial forest plantings which took place in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, hill farming has been struggling in its own right. It might be worth another quick reading along those lines. Hill cattle survived for a time beyond the advent of modern, more commercial European beasts because they were doing something that limousines and Simmentals could not. Heavy continental cows grow quickly, but they can't stomach rough grass, and the cold weather sickens them. Galloways thrive outdoors, and they're designed to be tough. That thick, double-layered coat pays dividends. There's no better protection against dull weather and cold. The beasts are highly prized in Canada and the American Midwest, where they take winter far more seriously than we do, and it's hard to imagine the weather that would faze them. In fact, Galloways are so wedded to the bare sky that they often struggle with life indoors. They get sick, and their feet give out on concrete floors. Farmers who bring Galloways into their sheds during the winter often have to shave their backs to let the sweat come out, otherwise the beasts begin to slump with pneumonia. Galloways grow slowly, but they're cheap to keep if you've got the right kind of hill ground. Imagine horses for courses for cattle. European beasts were shipped in to graze the better ground, while hill breeds were left to their own devices. This might have been the new order of things, but then the value of old-fashioned beef carcasses steadily dropped until they couldn't repay the work required to manage them. You'd make less on a Galloway after 3 years than you could on a commercial cross at 2. Government schemes recognised the value of hill cattle and offered subsidies, but still it was tough work in lonely, awkward places. Younger folk were less fond of hard living, and Galloways became a project for old farmers who couldn't imagine life without them. There's an old saying that Galloways can survive on fresh air and a fine view, and there's some truth in the sentiment. Left to their own devices on a patchwork of rough, varied moorland, Galloways will steadily grow into a fine marbled carcass. But nobody can afford to wait that long anymore, and with new deadlines for slaughtering, farmers rush their cattle with rich grass to beat the 30 months. Farmers laugh at the suggestion of fresh air and a fine view as if it can't be done anymore. Hill cattle are scarce these days, and most of the moorland grazing has been given over to sheep. This seems like a straight swap, but sheep can't pick up the slack, and they've driven an even steeper change in the hills. The land becomes poorer, and the freshness flows out of it. Sheep have begun to accelerate change in the hills, and now they get a bad name as wreckers and woolly maggots. It's unfair to blame them. They miss cattle more than anyone. Sheep and cows used to work beautifully together. The two overlap in a steady rhythm of mutual back scratching, and one supports the other. Cattle like long grass, and sheep prefer it short. Cows do the heavy lifting, and sheep follow up with the details. If you can strike the right balance, the two will tackle the grass as it comes and keep the land in a choppy, buzzing balance. When you remove the cows, the sheep are restricted. They don't have the clout to punch into thick grass, and they're shut out of bracken. They focus their attention on the easy and accessible areas and hammer these into a billiard table. There's nothing left to hide a curlew's eggs. Other places are harder to reach, and they grow rank and tall without any grazing. The grass stands above your head, and then it's too tall for a curlew to land. The place falls oddly still. So I'd seen that imbalance at first hand here in Galloway, but in working on conservation projects for curlews, I'd seen the same problems unfolding again and again across the UK. I wanted to tackle it myself with my own cows, and even from the outset it became clear that hill cattle offer an extraordinary boost for biodiversity. In many places, cows are the missing piece of the puzzle. They're the difference between productive, diverse moorland habitats and an extensive wasteland. There is so much to gain from this kind of farming, but it might be coming too late for Galloway. In recent years, the foresters have returned to finish the job they started here on a scale which promises to match the grand schemes of the 1960s and 70s. Modern forestry has advanced a great deal from those early days, but the objective is still to maximize financial yields, and that means dense plantations of spruce trees. Government policies and financial incentives are so strong that I could no longer afford to buy hill grazing even if I wanted to. 5 years ago, it might have cost £800 an acre to buy rough land to graze cattle and protect curlews. Now that same land might sell for £3,000 an acre, and those prices are often driven by foreign investment companies based in Austria and Denmark. Those new owners will never come to Galloway, but the impact they're having here is staggering. It's a further feeling of dislocation from the rest of Scotland to realise that what's happening here simply could not happen anywhere else. Talk of land reform cuts mustard in the Highlands, but as we clamour to rid ourselves of absentee landlords in Aberdeenshire, land in Galloway is being gobbled up at a rate that would make your hair stand on end. And it's happening right now, today. Even since the new year, 3 big hill farms that I knew as a boy have been sold to become forest. And with that sale, their curlews will be gone forever. During the run-up to the general election the winter before last, various political parties posted their ambitions to plant more trees as a response to climate change. It became a competition to boast of ever bigger targets, but there was almost no time or attention spent on thinking about the quality of the trees or where they would go. Hundreds of thousands of trees will be planted in Galloway this year, and that will allow governments to boost their green credentials. Green policy has been reduced to a simple mantra: the more trees you plant, the more sustainable you are. But there is a vast cost to that work, which hides behind the scenes. A cost that can be measured sometimes in biodiversity loss, in the degradation and loss of carbon stored in peatland, and in the shattered geography of rural communities. Of course, this has provoked a sense of upset and desperation in Galloway. Community councils mobilised petitions which are taken to the council offices in Dumfries, and concerns are raised and recorded. But when it comes to forestry proposals, and also wind farm developments, if community opposition can make its way to Holyrood, it's often overturned. We get the trees and we get the wind turbines anyway. I often feel like people are giving up here. We aren't allowed a say in what happens to our own landscape. It feels like we've been designated as the timber and renewables district, but nobody can remember consenting to that. There's no way that I can stand against this tidal wave of finance and subsidy. I'm out on a limb, working at something that has been dying probably since before I was born. I can make strong arguments in favour of native traditional cattle breeds, in favour of hill farming and the conservation of important birds like curlews. Everything I do is based upon proven sustainable credentials. I could make a real difference here, but there is an increasing sense that I'm pushing against the tide, that bigger pressures are at play, and there's no time for my kind of work anymore. Compare hill farming and forestry on financial terms, and I look like a lunatic. The numbers don't add up for me, and there's the bottom line. A line which is unable to measure small details like wild birds, and the satisfaction of working with your neighbours to bale hay or gather sheep. Details which define a place, and give each landscape its own sense of pride and variety. It's not really in my nature to be confrontational or politically minded, but much of this thinking has come together at a time when we are feeling very much out on a limb in Galloway, and in writing back and forth to the excellent farming poet Jim Carruth, I was consoled by his comment that issues around rural communities are inherently political. Following that correspondence, I feel more confident about standing up to say, this is not okay. So it made sense to start writing about Galloway against this complex and fast-moving backdrop, particularly as my own farming project began to gather steam and momentum almost 8 years ago. That feeling of loss and change was pervasive, and it was interesting to think about a hidden Scotland which lay behind the scenes in a position of disempowered stasis. One of my friends asked how it felt to be working in isolation, loving a landscape that everyone else has walked away from. I replied that it's a reward in itself, but I never reckoned to be so lonely here. And I don't relish the feeling that I'm out on a limb. I'm not trying to be different or to swim against the current. I'm trying to live the life that was handed down to me by my parents and their parents and their parents. I'm trying to make something that is true to what I know of this place. From time to time, I look up and realize how completely the old world has vanished. Of course, I can't speak for Galloway any more than one person can speak for any place, but it felt important to give a voice to people and communities who have never really been heard before. proud people and stubborn people who often ask for little more than to be left alone in peace. There is so much in our story to help us all understand why small details are important, but one thing seems increasingly clear. The day that we stopped being able to draw a line around Galloway, we all lost sight of something that was very valuable. It doesn't come easily to complain, and I was keen to avoid harping on about grievance or complaint in this book. In marking the loss of an ancient Galloway culture and landscape, I was keen to celebrate the things that make us unique, the things which I've been feeling since I was a boy, and trying to attach myself to a Scotland which I now realise was too big and too complex for anyone to hold in the palm of their hand. It's there in wet rocks and the sound of larks, in the Solway's tang of mud and moss with a raven above the munch of browsing cattle. It doesn't exist anywhere else, so forget the fact it's nearly gone. My God, what a place. Thank you.